Morning, everybody. How you doing? Welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all happy and healthy doing the things you love with those that you love doing them with. Bugsy's searching for balls. She's got no idea where it is. That should give me a few minutes to talk to you. I hope you can do me some favors, guys. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button for me on the video. Your like game has been sensational, and I really appreciate it. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell and drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts on today's topic. And look, the weather today is horrible. It's muggy. It's lunchtime, but it feels like it is dusk. It feels like there's bad things coming on the horizon, like a storm is brewing. And I wonder if that is an analogy for what we're going to talk about. The vibe of the video is about profit and sustainability rules, financial fair play, and another pivot, another agreed upon in principle, but yet to be ratified movement in the way that the Premier League teams consider sustainability a priority and an approach and attempt to level the playing field. It's been very interesting to see who voted in favour for this, who voted against it and why. And as I say, we're going to talk about the ramifications of this right now. So just to give you a bit of background, if you're not familiar, if you're bored of financial fair play, I'll try and keep this as brief as possible. But the current system that is in place right now and will be next season is based on loss-based accounting. So a Premier League club is not allowed to lose any more than £105 million in any 3-year period. Nottingham Forest fell foul of it this year, as did Leicester. Both of those teams have faced or will face points deductions at the end of the season. They're both under appeal. Everton also this season were found guilty of it, twice in fact, one for a previous accounting period and then one for this season when they spent too much money, and as such faced 2 different points deductions. Both of them appealed, one of them already resolved, the other one's still happening and won't happen until the end of the season, which is madness. We've spoken about this before. The fact that we won't know at the end of the season, or there's a scenario where we won't know at the end of the season when the final whistle goes on the final game, who stays up and who goes down, because of appeals that are still waiting to happen, is crazy. Anyway, next season, those rules will still be in play. The season after, this is when these intended changes are going to come in. And the intended changes are that we're moving away from loss-based accounting because it's not deemed to be reasonable or fair. And we're moving to a system that more closely reflects UEFA's squad spending ratios. If you want to participate in Europe this season, then you're only allowed to spend 90% of your entire club's revenue on the combined figures of transfer fees that have been amortised for the year, player agents fees, and player salaries and coaching salaries. Next season that becomes 80%. The following season it becomes 70%, where that's where it will remain according to current rules. And so for teams that are playing in Europe next season, you will have to abide by both the loss-based accounting and an 80% cap on your spend on those combined figures I've just mentioned. The following season, the loss-based accounting goes out of the window, and if you're playing in Europe, you have to abide by 70%, and according to the rules that have been approved but yet to be ratified, you will also have to adhere to 85% thresholds in the Premier League. So if you're playing in Europe, then that's kind of irrelevant because you're already adhering to stricter measures in UEFA's rules. If you're not playing in Europe, then you have to adhere to an 85% threshold on those figures. What's interesting is that on Monday, the teams got together and voted, after hashing out the pros and cons, they voted in principle to also add in another factor. And that is something called anchoring, whereby the lowest revenue generating club in the Premier League in the 26-27 season, whatever that number is, say it's £100 million, say it's Leicester City, and they make £100 million through 2 factors. 1, TV media rights, and 2, your commercial sponsorship deals. That's the revenue, not match day revenue, not ticket concessions, none of those merchandise, just your sponsorship, commercial sponsorship deals and your TV media rights. If that's 100 million, then every club will be limited to spend a multiple number of that. And well, it could be between 4.5 times and 5 times. We'll use 5 times to make the numbers easier. So in a nutshell, if Leicester were to make £100 million, then every team in the Premier League would be limited to spend £500 million, or no more than £500 million. What's interesting about that is that the only club that would have been in breach of that number, had it been in play right now, would have been Chelsea, who spent £518 million last season. Even Manchester City didn't spend that much, and they bring in £700 million in revenue this year. What's unclear to me, and I don't think it's clear to anybody, is whether or not this anchoring rule is to replace the intended change to the 85% squad ratio spend, or to be a bolt-on to it. So there's two scenarios we're going to talk about playing out, and I hope it will make sense. In the world where it is a replacement, then teams that do not play in Europe will be able to spend £500 million regardless of their revenue. So if you're Newcastle United, who bring in about £230 million, then you're able to spend twice as much money as your club generates, which is music to the ears of the PIF and the Saudi Arabian family that owns Newcastle. It'll be music to the ears of Newcastle United and any other club who consider their ambitions to spend money bottlenecked by the rules. If you're a fan of a club who want to spend more than they're allowed to, then they will be very much in favour of it if it's a replacement to the 85% threshold. What's interesting is that in that scenario, teams will be able to spend £500 million hoping to close the gap on the teams in Europe. And then when they then qualify for, if they were to then qualify for Europe, they would then have to adhere to a 70% threshold. In an effort to sign players and spend the money where you're spending, in the case of Newcastle, twice as much money as your club generates, then you may end up signing players on big money, on big salaries, paying huge agents' fees, and find yourself living within the £500 million threshold cap 1 year, qualifying for Europe, and then as a consequence, finding out that you're overspending the 70% threshold of what your club generates the next year by being in Europe. So it's not as clear-cut and easy to kind of see the pathway to gap closing as possible. If they were to spend £500 million Newcastle this summer, just for argument's sake, which is twice their revenue, they were to go out and bring in 3 world-class £100 million players, pay those guys their fees of 350 grand a week. Next season qualify in 4th place in the Champions League, which would probably add an extra 50 or 60 million pounds to their revenue, bringing their revenue to 320 million. All of a sudden, the stranglehold and the bottleneck comes back in. And so they may then find themselves in breach of UEFA rules the following year as a consequence of throwing caution to the wind when they weren't in Europe in order to close the gap. So it's almost like kicking the can down the road regarding sustainability. For teams that are miles away from Europe consistently but want to be able to kind of gently move themselves in that direction, then if they have ambitious owners and they're smart enough to not put themselves in jeopardy in the ability to pay their bills and not be considered a problem as a going concern, then it might work out in the short term, but they still have to keep one eye on the potential ramifications of qualifying for Europe if the amount of money that they've spent in the years preceding that has ended up resulting in squad cost ratios that supersede 70%. In a world where this £500 million anchoring system is a bolt-on to the 85% threshold, then in a nutshell, it doesn't really affect anybody other than a team like Manchester City, whom it's very likely that in a couple of years' time will be potentially generating £1 billion or more in revenue. In a world where they were generating £1 billion or more in revenue, then according to the European rules, the UEFA rules, they would be able to spend 70% of that on the combined figures of your fees. And so that would be £700 million. But in order to participate in the Premier League, they wouldn't be able to spend any more than 5 times that of the lowest generating revenue club, which in the scenario we're playing out is a Leicester City, who make £100 million on those figures. And so they would, in a nutshell, be generating £1 billion of revenue, but only be able to spend 500 million, which in essence is a 50% squad spend cap. And that is prohibitive for them, and it makes a lot of sense as to why they would say no and be one of the few teams that did in fact reject this proposal on Monday. So Manchester City were the first team to reject it, and you can understand why. It doesn't really suit them in any way, shape or form. They think that they've generated their money fair and square. I would argue that they are still getting the significant juice from the squeeze that they put into the club before the FFP rules were allowed or were implemented initially. Manchester United were the second team to reject this proposal. And again, you can understand why. Manchester United traditionally have been a club that have had one of the biggest global brands in sport around the world. And if their new owners come in, if Sir Jim Ratcliffe comes in and Dave Brailsford comes in, and if their plan of action does yield the returns that they hope it will, then you could foresee a situation in the next couple of years where Manchester United are back playing at the very top table consistently, back in the title races year in, year out, and generating the revenue once again that they have always done prior. And so you could also envision a scenario where Manchester United in the future are generating £1 billion in revenue or more. And so they wouldn't want to be strangle-held by a bottleneck around an anchoring mechanism that would be limited by how much Leicester bring in. The other club that rejected it was Aston Villa. And try as I might, I've done a lot of research to try and find a justification from someone who knows more than I do as to why Aston Villa's owners would reject this. People think of Aston Villa's owners as people that are very ambitious, that want to spend more money than they're currently allowed to through the generation of revenue that the club brings in. They're American, and so are very familiar with the NFL system, the draft system, and how every year there is a levelling of the playing fields to a degree by the worst performing teams getting the first picks on the best players of the next crop out of college. And so you would have thought that they would have been on board a system that allows them to close the gap on teams like Manchester City and United quicker. But they rejected it. I can't really figure out why. Maybe they have faith that the path that they're on is good enough for them to be able to close the gap on the big teams anyway, organically, as best they can. And they don't really want a scenario playing out where Newcastle United can eat their lunch, or other teams that maybe have ambitious owners but are currently more strangle-held than Aston Villa are. In any event, they rejected it, which was a massive surprise. And the fourth team that did the equivalent of a rejection is Chelsea. They didn't actually reject. I think that was more for PR reasons. I think they abstained. But essentially, because you need 15 votes in favour of a movement to pass, then abstaining from it is essentially the equivalent of a rejection. You can understand why Chelsea would do it. You can understand why City and United would do it. Why Aston Villa rejected it, I'm not sure. Everybody else, including Tottenham Hotspur, my team, everybody else voted in favour of it. And again, that's what I'm saying. The only thing that's unclear to me is whether this is a bolt-on to the suggested squad cost ratio rules or a replacement of it. In any event, the way I perceive it to be, if you're a team that's on the cusp of European football, then having the freedom to spend 500 million when your club doesn't generate it is a dangerous system where you might get caught out by spending too much money on players that end up putting your salary number, your wages to turnover ratio too high. You may spend too much money on players in order to close that gap, then find yourself ahead of where you thought you were going to be, qualifying for Europe and then having to adhere to 70% ratios. Remember, if you qualify for the Conference League, you have to participate to the 70% threshold in the 26-27 season. And your club will only generate about £15 million in revenue, even if you go all the way to win it. Which is why if Chelsea had won the Carabao Cup, they would have found themselves in a real predicament, because they would have qualified for a tournament where the consequences of being in it would be so difficult for their numbers to make ends meet on. And yet, even if they won the tournament, wouldn't move the needle enough to get themselves out of trouble. Which is why there were suggestions that they would actually reject the invitation into the Conference League, which, you know, is crazy to kind of consider what that would look like. And so it's all very well thinking that if you get into the top four, you're going to earn 50-60 million pound more in revenue, and that won't be the difference anyway, so it's worth it. But the more likely scenario, if you're not currently playing in Europe regularly, is that you'll qualify for the Europa Cup, Europa League, or the Conference League, and the money from that competition may not be worth the squeeze of the overspend if you're limited, or if your unlimited spending allows you to spend, in the case of Newcastle, twice as much money as your club generates. In a world where it's a bolt-on, as I say, it doesn't really make that much difference to anybody other than the teams that are likely to be generating 10 times the amount of money as the lowest generating team in the league. and that is Manchester City and probably Manchester United. Even Tottenham Hotspur, who find a way to get as much blood from the stone in our club as possible, are very unlikely to be able to put themselves in a revenue generating position where you're going to be making more than 8-9 times what a Leicester or whoever the lowest generating revenue team is. So to me, it's a bit of a nothing burger if it's a bolt-on, if it's a removal of the squad cost ratio rules for the Premier League. I think it's fraught with danger, fraught with risk for teams that punch a little bit above their weight and have immediate success that's unpredictably quick, that then puts them in a position where they have to adhere to a different set of rules that's incredibly strict and have spent too much on too high a caliber of player, and then find themselves then in breach of UEFA rules and have the consequences of that, which can look very, very severe as well. Just ask AC Milan. Let me know your thoughts, guys. Like, subscribe and comment, and as always, bye-bye.